You don't belong in here. The words landed cold the moment Officer Brian Mitchell stepped in front of the glass doors of the private terminal at Los Angeles International Airport, his voice calm but firm enough to make nearby travelers slow their pace and glance over. The morning light filtered through the massive windows, stretching across polished floors and reflecting off the uniformed presence that seemed to define authority in this space. In front of him stood Alicia Johnson, holding a simple black leather bag and a passport in her hand, her posture steady, her expression unreadable, as if she had already heard those words before in a different life. Mitchell didn't move aside. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, scanning her from her shoes to her coat, making a silent judgment he didn't bother to hide. Around them, the private terminal hummed with quiet luxury, distant footsteps on marble, the soft rolling of luggage wheels, the occasional announcement echoing from behind tinted glass doors. Alicia said nothing at first, only adjusted her grip on her bag as if confirming she had arrived exactly where she was supposed to be. "Sir," she said finally, her voice even and composed, "I have clearance for this terminal." Mitchell gave a short, almost dismissive exhale, as though he had heard the same claim too many times from people who misunderstood how the system worked. He reached for her documents without asking, glancing at the name, then back at her face, then back again as if trying to reconcile what he expected with what he saw. "Clearance like this doesn't just appear," he replied, his tone dropping into something colder, more certain. A few passengers nearby slowed their steps, sensing tension without fully understanding it, their attention drifting toward the interaction like metal drawn to gravity. Alicia didn't step back. She didn't raise her voice. She simply held his gaze long enough that the silence between them began to feel heavier than the words being spoken. Mitchell straightened slightly, adjusting his stance as if reinforcing an invisible boundary only he was authorized to enforce. "Ma'am," he continued, emphasizing the word in a way that stripped it of respect, "this area is restricted for verified passengers and personnel only." Alicia looked past him for a brief moment, toward the glass corridor leading deeper into the terminal, where private aircraft information flickered on digital displays and staff moved with quiet urgency. Then she looked back at him. "I am aware of the restrictions," she said softly, "that's why I am here." For a fraction of a second, something flickered in Mitchell's expression, not doubt exactly, but irritation at the lack of compliance he expected. He tapped her documents once against his palm, as if concluding the matter. Behind them, the airport world continued its rhythm, indifferent to the exchange, but within that small circle of space between officer and traveler, the air tightened, and neither of them stepped aside. Officer Brian Mitchell held the documents a little longer than necessary, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the name again, as if repetition would resolve the discomfort he was starting to feel but refusing to acknowledge. Around them, the private terminal continued to move in quiet precision, travelers in tailored clothing passing through security lanes with calm efficiency, their conversations low and measured, their attention only briefly brushing the confrontation before drifting away. Alicia Johnson remained still, her posture unchanged, as though waiting for a process she already understood would take place whether or not it respected her presence. Mitchell finally handed the documents back without looking at her directly, then shifted his stance so that his body subtly blocked the entrance path forward. "This access does not match your profile," he said, his tone now more controlled than before, as if he had settled into a conclusion and no longer intended to question it. Alicia blinked once, not in surprise, but in quiet acknowledgement, then responded with the same steady voice, "My access is registered under private clearance through the executive terminal system." Mitchell gave a faint, dismissive nod, the kind used when someone believes they are being tested with words rather than facts. He lifted his radio slightly, speaking a short confirmation into it, and within moments, a second officer approached from the side corridor, his expression neutral but alert. The small crowd that had gathered began to grow more still, sensing that the situation was now being documented, evaluated, and recorded in real time. Mitchell gestured toward Alicia with a slight tilt of his head. "We are going to verify this claim," he said, loud enough for nearby travelers to hear clearly. Alicia did not respond immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the glass wall that separated the terminal from the runway area, where a sleek white aircraft sat in the distance, partially visible under the morning light, its presence suggesting exclusivity and precision. A faint reflection of movement appeared on the polished floor as airport staff passed behind her, but none intervened. Mitchell stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice this time. "If this is an error, it will be handled appropriately," he said, though the phrasing carried an edge that implied consequences regardless of outcome. Alicia finally raised her gaze to meet his, and for the first time, there was something in her expression that was not defiance or frustration, but quiet certainty, as if she had already accounted for every possible direction this moment could take. The second officer checked a tablet, scrolling through a secured system, his brow tightening slightly as lines of data updated on the screen. The ambient noise of the terminal seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the subtle rhythm of anticipation. Mitchell watched the screen without speaking, his jaw set, waiting for confirmation that would either justify his position or challenge it in a way he was not prepared to publicly acknowledge. Alicia adjusted her grip on her bag again, small and deliberate, then spoke one final sentence into the silence, calm and measured, "Everything you need is already in your system." The moment Alicia Johnson spoke, the air around her seemed to tighten even further, not from tension alone, but from the way certainty can sometimes disrupt people who are used to controlling uncertainty. Officer Brian Mitchell glanced at the second officer's tablet, his eyes scanning for any immediate confirmation that would reinforce his authority in the situation, but the slow movement of the other man's expression suggested something was not resolving as quickly as expected. The terminal remained active behind them, passengers continuing through security checks and private boarding corridors, yet the focus of everyone nearby had narrowed into a small, quiet circle centered on Alicia and the officers. Mitchell shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance as if the physical act could stabilize the growing discomfort in the situation. The second officer scrolled again, his brow tightening more noticeably now, then paused for a longer moment than before. Alicia did not speak. She simply stood with the same calm presence, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the distant runway visible through the glass, where a private aircraft remained parked under the soft morning light. Mitchell finally broke the silence with a low voice directed at the second officer. "What are you seeing?" he asked, keeping his tone controlled, but with a clear edge of impatience beneath it. The second officer hesitated before answering, choosing his words carefully. "There is clearance in the system," he said, then paused again as if verifying what he was reading, "but it is not standard passenger clearance." Mitchell's expression tightened slightly, his attention snapping fully back to the tablet. Alicia remained still, her posture unchanged, as if the explanation unfolding in front of her was simply confirming what she had already known would happen. Around them, the subtle noise of the terminal seemed to return for a moment, a distant announcement, the rolling of a suitcase wheel, the soft echo of footsteps, but it all felt secondary to the silence forming between the three of them. Mitchell exhaled slowly through his nose, then spoke again, this time more firmly. "Then verify the authorization source," he said, emphasizing each word as if structure itself could restore control. The second officer nodded and began navigating deeper into the system, his fingers moving with increased focus. Alicia finally shifted her gaze back toward Mitchell, her expression unchanged but her presence now carrying a quiet weight that was harder to dismiss. "You are looking in the correct place," she said gently, not as a correction, but as a statement of fact. Mitchell did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her for a longer moment than before, as though reassessing not only the situation but the assumptions that had shaped his initial judgment. The nearby passengers who had slowed earlier now fully stopped, pretending to check phones or adjust belongings while clearly observing the exchange. The second officer's screen refreshed again, and this time he paused entirely, his hand hovering above the device as if unsure whether to proceed. Mitchell leaned slightly closer. "Report it," he said quietly. The second officer swallowed and finally spoke. "The clearance is tied to a private aviation authorization under executive ownership status." The words landed without force, but their effect was immediate. Mitchell's eyes shifted subtly, just a fraction, as if recalibrating everything he had assumed from the beginning. Alicia's expression did not change, but there was a slight lowering of her gaze, not in submission, but in quiet acknowledgement that the truth had finally been read aloud. The terminal felt stiller now, not because anything had stopped, but because everything present had begun to understand that the situation was no longer ordinary. For a brief moment after the system confirmation appeared on the officer's device, the space around the group seemed to lose its previous rigidity, as if the airport itself had shifted from judgment into observation. Officer Brian Mitchell stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the second officer's tablet, processing the words that had just been spoken and trying to reconcile them with the posture he had taken only minutes earlier. The phrase executive ownership status lingered in the air between them, not as an accusation or correction, but as a factual weight that required recalibration. Alicia Johnson remained in the same position she had held since the beginning of the encounter, her presence steady and unchanged, as though the outcome had always been moving toward this exact point regardless of resistance. Around them, the private terminal's rhythm continued, though noticeably softened, with fewer passing footsteps and longer pauses from nearby travelers who now made no effort to hide their attention. The second officer lowered the tablet slightly, glancing toward Mitchell with a restrained expression that suggested uncertainty about how to proceed within the structure of authority they were both expected to uphold. Mitchell finally broke his silence, his voice lower than before, carrying a controlled tension that was no longer rooted in confidence but in adjustment. "Confirm the identity match," he said, each word measured, as if precision could restore the clarity he had lost. The second officer nodded and re-engaged the system, this time navigating deeper verification layers that displayed extended authorization records tied to private aviation clearance protocols. Alicia's gaze shifted briefly toward the glass corridor again, where movement from airport staff continued uninterrupted, contrasting the stillness that had formed in her immediate surroundings. She did not appear anxious or defensive, only patient, as if waiting for others to reach a conclusion she had already accepted long ago. Mitchell took a small step back, not away from her directly, but enough to create distance between his initial certainty and the unfolding confirmation in front of him. The second officer's expression changed subtly as additional verification lines populated the screen, each update reinforcing the same conclusion without contradiction. He cleared his throat before speaking, his tone more formal now. "Authorization is linked to a registered private aircraft ownership profile," he said, then paused briefly, "with direct terminal access privileges for this location." The words settled into the space with a quiet finality that removed the ambiguity from the situation without introducing any emotion to replace it. Mitchell exhaled slowly, his posture no longer rigid but noticeably recalibrated, as though the structure he relied on had not collapsed, but had simply expanded beyond his initial understanding. Alicia finally turned her full attention back toward him, her expression calm and composed, carrying neither satisfaction nor confrontation, only a steady awareness that the process had reached its natural conclusion. The surrounding passengers resumed faint movement, though more cautiously now, as if unsure whether the moment had fully resolved or simply transformed into something quieter. The second officer lowered the tablet completely, stepping slightly aside as protocol shifted from verification to acknowledgement. Mitchell looked at Alicia for a longer moment than before, not with resistance, but with the quiet recognition that the boundaries he had enforced were never meant to contain this situation. The terminal lights reflected softly on the polished floor beneath them, and for the first time since the encounter began, no one spoke. The silence that followed the final confirmation was no longer tense in the same way it had been before, but instead carried a different weight, one that felt closer to realization than resistance. Officer Brian Mitchell stood with his hands lowered at his sides, no longer blocking the entrance path, though his posture still carried the habits of authority that had defined him for years. The second officer stepped slightly back, keeping a respectful distance as the system display on his tablet dimmed into standby. Alicia Johnson remained where she was, not advancing, not retreating, simply existing in the space as if the outcome had already been integrated into her expectations long before anyone else reached it. Around them, the private terminal resumed its normal rhythm more fully now, passengers moving again with soft footsteps and low conversations, though the earlier curiosity had not entirely disappeared. Mitchell finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, stripped of the sharp certainty it had carried earlier. "Understood," he said simply, as if acknowledging not just the system verification but the shift in the situation itself. He glanced briefly toward the entrance behind him, then back at Alicia, as though recalculating the appropriate response in real time. The second officer gave a small nod, signaling that protocol had been satisfied, and began to step away to rejoin his assigned position. Alicia adjusted the strap of her black leather bag once, a small controlled movement that marked the end of waiting rather than the beginning of anything new. Mitchell hesitated for a moment longer, then took a half step aside, fully clearing the path that had been blocked since the encounter began. The physical space between them now reflected the change that had already occurred in the system records, no longer defined by suspicion or challenge, but by acknowledgement. Alicia did not immediately move forward. Instead, she paused for a brief moment, her gaze shifting once more toward Mitchell, not with confrontation, but with a calm that carried no urgency to prove anything further. Mitchell met her gaze briefly, then lowered his eyes slightly, a subtle gesture that suggested the internal recalibration of someone who had just been shown a reality that did not align with initial assumptions. The surrounding travelers resumed their quiet flow, though a few still lingered in observation, their attention now shaped more by curiosity about resolution than conflict. A terminal staff member approached from the side corridor but stopped short when seeing that the situation had already transitioned out of enforcement. Alicia finally began to walk forward, her steps steady and unhurried, moving past Mitchell without any change in pace or expression. As she passed, the atmosphere around her seemed to shift with her movement, not dramatically, but in a way that made the earlier tension feel like a distant layer now settled behind the present moment. Mitchell turned slightly as she moved away, watching her proceed toward the private access corridor that led deeper into the terminal. For a brief second, his expression carried something closer to reflection than authority, as if the encounter had extended beyond procedure into something he would remember differently than he had expected when it began. The second officer returned fully to his station, and the system screens resumed their normal interface displays, but the interaction had already left its mark in the quiet space between routine and realization. The corridor leading deeper into the private terminal carried a quieter atmosphere now, as if the earlier tension had been absorbed into the structure of the place and replaced with routine movement once again. Alicia Johnson walked forward at an even pace, her steps steady against the polished floor, the soft reflection of overhead lighting following her like a faint trail. Behind her, the interaction at the entrance had fully dissolved into standard airport operations, with Officer Brian Mitchell returning to his post and the second officer resuming system checks without further interruption. Yet for Mitchell, the moment did not fully leave his attention, lingering instead as a quiet interruption in the certainty he had carried into his shift. He stood near the entrance line, watching the flow of passengers with a more measured focus, his earlier confidence replaced by a controlled stillness that suggested internal recalibration rather than external change. Alicia continued through the designated private access corridor, where the environment shifted subtly from public terminal design to more exclusive infrastructure, with fewer people, quieter lighting, and a more controlled sense of movement. Staff members in tailored uniforms acknowledged her presence with brief nods, their reactions calm and unremarkable, as if her arrival fit naturally within their expected operations. The glass walls of the corridor revealed glimpses of the runway area beyond, where aircraft stood positioned under the clear morning sky, engines idle, ground crews moving with precise coordination. Alicia paused briefly near a junction point in the corridor, where a small digital display confirmed boarding status for multiple private flights. Her attention moved across the screen for a moment before she adjusted her direction toward a specific gate, her expression remaining composed and unchanged. Meanwhile, back at the entrance checkpoint, Mitchell reviewed the interaction mentally, replaying the system verification and the tone of the second officer's confirmation. The structured authority he relied on had not failed, yet it had produced a result that challenged the assumptions he had applied at the beginning of the encounter. The second officer completed his log entry, noting the clearance validation and closing the alert without further action required. Around them, the terminal resumed its normal operational rhythm, but Mitchell remained stationary for a few extra seconds, his gaze unfocused as he processed the shift from enforcement to acknowledgement that had occurred in such a short span of time. In the private corridor, Alicia reached the final access point leading toward the boarding area, where a uniformed attendant stepped forward and confirmed her identity through a quick scan that required no additional verification steps. The attendant's expression remained neutral, professional, and efficient, offering no reaction beyond procedural completion. Alicia gave a slight nod and proceeded forward, transitioning from the corridor into the open view of the private runway platform. The air beyond the terminal felt brighter and more expansive, with clear visibility across the tarmac and the distant skyline of Los Angeles stretching under a pale morning horizon. Ground crew movements continued in synchronized patterns, preparing aircraft for departure with calm precision. Alicia stopped briefly at the edge of the boarding path, her gaze directed toward the aircraft assigned to her clearance, its presence confirming the system validation that had already been processed behind her. The moment held no celebration, no visible reaction, only a quiet acknowledgement of arrival after a sequence of resistance that no longer required response. Behind her, the corridor remained open and still, while the terminal operations continued uninterrupted, carrying forward the constant flow of arrivals and departures as if nothing had shifted except the understanding of those who had witnessed it. The boarding platform was quiet in a way that felt heavier than noise, as if even the wind had been softened by the presence of something officially confirmed yet still emotionally difficult to process. Alicia Johnson stood near the edge of the private boarding path, her attention resting on the aircraft ahead, where ground crew members moved with calm efficiency around the final pre-departure preparations. The white fuselage reflected the morning light in clean, uninterrupted lines, reinforcing a sense of precision and ownership that no longer required explanation. Behind her, the corridor remained open, and through it came a subtle shift in atmosphere as additional personnel began to receive updated internal confirmations regarding clearance status. Back at the terminal entrance, Officer Brian Mitchell remained in place for a moment longer than necessary after the interaction had concluded, his posture no longer rigid but noticeably restrained, as though his internal sense of order had been slightly displaced by the outcome he had witnessed. The second officer stood nearby, reviewing final system logs, while airport operations continued to flow around them with routine consistency. Yet Mitchell's focus was no longer on the passengers passing through or the structure of enforcement he had maintained earlier in the morning. Instead, his attention drifted toward the private runway direction, where the aircraft associated with the clearance now sat fully active in his awareness. A quiet notification arrived through his radio channel moments later, brief and procedural, confirming that the aircraft at Gate 7 was cleared for immediate departure under Executive Authorization Protocol. The message itself was neutral, but its timing reinforced everything that had already been established in the system records. Mitchell did not respond immediately. He simply listened, his gaze fixed forward, as if trying to reconcile the clarity of procedure with the weight of his earlier assumptions. In the distance, barely visible through the terminal structure, he could see movement near the boarding area, where Alicia had now begun transitioning toward the aircraft stairs. There was no urgency in her motion, only a steady continuity that suggested she had never been outside the correct framework of access at any point during the encounter. A senior airport coordinator approached Mitchell from the side, speaking quietly after reviewing the same updated clearance logs. The conversation was brief, strictly informational, but the tone carried an unspoken recognition that the situation had been fully resolved in favor of verification over assumption. Mitchell nodded once, acknowledging the update without adding comment, though his expression reflected something more internal than procedural. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to look directly toward the runway again, where Alicia had now reached the base of the boarding stairs. She paused there for a second, not turning back, not acknowledging the terminal behind her, but simply standing at the threshold between ground and departure as the aircraft door remained open above her. The crew member stationed at the stairs stepped aside respectfully, confirming her identity with a quiet nod before allowing passage. Mitchell watched from a distance that separated observation from participation, his earlier authority now reduced to reflection. The realization that had been forming since the system confirmation was no longer abstract, it had become fully visible in action, movement, and acceptance at every level of the environment. Alicia ascended the stairs calmly, her figure framed briefly against the open aircraft doorway before she disappeared inside. The cabin lights flickered on in a soft sequence, signaling readiness for departure, while ground crew finalized final checks without delay. Mitchell remained still, his attention fixed on the aircraft as the door began to close. In that moment, there was no conflict remaining, only the quiet after-effect of a situation that had corrected itself through verification rather than force, leaving behind a stillness that extended across the terminal and into the memory of those who had witnessed it. Inside the aircraft cabin, the lighting was soft and evenly distributed, casting a calm tone over the polished interior surfaces and wide seating arrangement designed for private travel rather than public transit. Alicia Johnson had already taken her seat, positioned near the window, where the view of the runway stretched outward in clean geometric lines of concrete, equipment, and distant horizon. The cabin crew moved quietly through final preparation steps, securing overhead compartments and confirming flight readiness. Through subtle communication devices, every movement felt deliberate, controlled, and aligned with a system that required no further explanation. Outside, on the ground, Officer Brian Mitchell remained near the terminal glass, watching the aircraft as it completed its final boarding sequence. The door had closed moments earlier, sealing the interior from view, but the presence of the aircraft itself now carried a different meaning than it had at the beginning of the encounter. Mitchell stood still, his hands relaxed at his sides, no longer engaged in enforcement posture, but instead in a quiet state of reflection that had gradually replaced his earlier certainty. The second officer had already returned to normal duties, leaving Mitchell momentarily isolated in thought as airport operations continued around him with uninterrupted rhythm. A soft notification blinked on a nearby terminal display confirming final departure clearance, and ground staff began to withdraw equipment from the aircraft's immediate vicinity. The engines started with a low, steady sound that carried across the open runway space, subtle at first but growing into a controlled presence that signaled imminent departure. Mitchell's gaze followed the aircraft as it began to move forward slowly, aligning with the designated runway path. There was no urgency in its motion, only precision, as if every second had already been accounted for in advance. As the aircraft turned slightly into position, Mitchell exhaled quietly, a breath that carried no words but reflected the full sequence of what had unfolded from the initial moment of denial to the final confirmation of access. The memory of Alicia Johnson standing calmly at the terminal entrance returned briefly to his mind, not as conflict, but as a fixed point of realization that had shifted his understanding of control and assumption. The aircraft paused at the start of the runway, engines steady, awaiting final clearance from air traffic control. Inside the cabin, Alicia remained composed, her attention directed forward, unaffected by the procedural delays that preceded departure. The captain's voice came through the cabin system, calm and professional, confirming readiness for takeoff and acknowledging the cleared route ahead. On the ground, Mitchell took a slow step back from the glass, his reflection briefly overlapping with the runway view before he turned slightly toward the interior of the terminal. The aircraft began its forward acceleration, gradually increasing speed along the runway with smooth, controlled motion. Within moments, it lifted from the ground, rising into the morning sky with a quiet certainty that matched the system that had authorized it. Mitchell watched until it became a small, distant shape against the light horizon, then gradually disappeared into open air. The terminal behind him continued its normal operations without interruption, passengers moving through security, announcements echoing softly, and staff maintaining their routines. Yet for Mitchell, the sequence of events remained present in a different way, not as disruption, but as a quiet correction of perception that would remain long after the aircraft had left the airspace. The aircraft had already disappeared into the distant sky, leaving only a fading trail of motion above the Los Angeles horizon, and the airport gradually returned to its uninterrupted rhythm of arrivals and departures. Inside the terminal, life resumed its structured flow, announcements echoing across polished floors, travelers moving through corridors, and staff returning to routine positions as if the earlier sequence of events had been absorbed into the system without disruption. Officer Brian Mitchell stood for a moment longer near the glass wall, his reflection faintly visible against the bright exterior light, now carrying a quieter expression that no longer matched the authority he had displayed at the beginning of the shift. The second officer passed behind him, offering a brief nod before continuing onward, already transitioning mentally into the next assignment as protocol demanded. Mitchell finally turned away from the runway view, walking slowly back toward the interior of the terminal, his steps measured but no longer driven by certainty or enforcement. As he moved through the corridor, passengers passed by him without recognition of the internal shift he carried, their attention focused on their own schedules, departures, and destinations. Yet for Mitchell, each step felt slightly detached from the structure he had trusted earlier in the day, replaced instead by a quieter awareness of how quickly assumptions could dissolve when confronted with verified reality. Near the central security area, he paused briefly, glancing at the monitor screens that displayed live system statuses, passenger flows, and clearance confirmations. The entry tied to the earlier incident remained recorded in the system logs, unchanged and factual, a permanent reference point within the airport's operational memory. He studied it for a moment without speaking, then lowered his gaze and exhaled slowly, as if acknowledging a conclusion that required no further action but would remain present in thought. Behind him, the terminal continued its steady movement, unaffected by individual realization, maintaining the precision of schedules, boarding calls, and coordinated ground operations. A nearby announcement echoed through the hall, directing passengers toward upcoming departures, blending seamlessly into the ambient structure of controlled motion. Mitchell eventually resumed walking, blending back into the flow of personnel moving between checkpoints and assignment zones, his posture now neutral rather than authoritative, reflective rather than directive. The earlier encounter no longer existed as an active event within the terminal's function, but it remained embedded in his awareness as a moment where procedure, assumption, and outcome had briefly diverged before resolving into verified truth. Outside, beyond the glass walls, the sky remained clear, and aircraft continued to take off and land in steady intervals, each one following its own path beyond the airport's horizon, while inside, the system of movement, verification, and human judgment continued forward without interruption.